What is the best evidence for the resurrection? And are there fresh arguments that Jesus actually rose from the grave? Dr. Jeremiah Johnston has a new book coming out. I was fortunate to get an early copy of it. It's called Body of Proof. I think it's fantastic. He lays out 7 reasons he believes in the resurrection. We're going to get into those. But Dr. J, I got to tell you, before we get to your fresh argument, whenever I hear someone say they have a new argument, I've got number 1, an eye roll. Second, I don't believe them. But in your case, it gave me pause because I know you and your scholarship, and I think you make a good point. So we're going to get into that. But thanks for coming back on the show.
Dr. McDowell, I love your show. Thank you for your kind words. It's great to be back with you from our beautiful Prestonwood Baptist Church studio here in Dallas, Texas.
Well, let's jump straight in because there's a lot of people, believers and probably some skeptics, who want to know what your best case is. So we're going to walk through these 7, but just a couple questions setting us up first. You did your doctoral dissertation on the resurrection. So you studied this. You sent me a 90,000 word monograph, and you've kind of popularized that for this book, so to speak. How did you come up with these 7? Was it like 7 is a biblical number, so I just need 7? Why these 7 arguments?
The 7 were the most compelling, and it really came out of taking the content that I researched when we lived in Oxford in 2009 to 2012, and just getting it down. You do this internationally, Sean. Just what is something the audience can remember that still challenges the skeptics, challenges the seekers, encourages those who are already Christian thinkers. But my audience is the vast majority of followers of Jesus who love Jesus, but if you ask them, hey, tell me, why do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus evidentially, and don't use your Bible, they're going to give you a deer in the headlights look. And so just spinning out out of several, I've taken 12 years since I finished the research to refine it in other publications as well, and also to allow scholars to give feedback at places like Society of Biblical Literature and other places where I've presented aspects of what's gone into this book. So 7 just worked out, and there's actually 2 more in the book. So maybe I should have renamed the subtitle 9 Reasons.
Well, fair enough. It's too late now once the cover's done. But
That's right.
One thing you do say, you say the best 7 reasons to believe and why it matters. Now, typically I would talk about why the resurrection matters after we've laid out why we think it's true. But this is my last question before we get to your 7. Tell me why the resurrection itself matters.
The resurrection event, as a factual event that occurred in space and time, matters because without it, in other words, if we were to say a resurrection-less Christianity is no Christianity at all. The entire belief system of the Christian movement hinges on the physical, bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ, to such an extent that Christianity, unlike any other religion or ism in the world, has put itself to the historical test that if Jesus did not physically rise from the dead in space and time, then we're really to be pitied. We really are believing in nothing, and there's no difference between Christianity and fairy tales and myths. That's why it's important.
Well, that's a pretty good case. The truth of Christianity rests upon the resurrection. So let's jump into year 7. And by the way, those of you watching, we're going to come back and we're going to take some questions at the end. So be thinking through your questions. And if you'll write question in caps and make your question succinct, we'll make sure we get it to Dr. Jeremiah Johnston. All right, Jay, let's jump in. You say reason number 1, society is transformed everywhere Christianity is introduced and embraced. So what do you mean by this? And why is that a reason to believe Jesus rose from the dead?
The resurrection event overwhelmed the followers of Jesus to such an extent that it became the core of their teaching and the very center of their practice and faith and life. So much so that the Dominical tradition of Jesus was actually, which is the teaching of Jesus, which was actually usurped by the event itself. The early Christian movement experienced the resurrection of Jesus, and it revolutionized their worldview to such an extent that everywhere the gospel goes, suddenly we see the gospel clashing with the worldviews of the time. And the cut and thrust of the Roman Empire, I've written a whole book on it, was hell on earth. And so we can trace out of the upper room the teaching that Jesus physically, bodily rose from the grave, married with the experience of the early Christians who actually saw him, touched him, had dined with him in his resurrection state, this caused them, it motivated them to spread the message because it is true, it has a life-transforming value. And that value extends to all people. Everything from the treatment of women and children to the very bedrock of what we might call Christian civilization or Western civilization. And so we lay out 10 ways in which, in the book, had Christianity been a resurrection-less religion, it would have died. And here's 10 ways that the society is radically different because Jesus, in fact, did rise from the dead.
Okay, now, so you point out certain things like the hospital movement and care for human rights, the development of science. I could easily see somebody push back and say, okay, you're right. It's the Christian ideas of this that foster this movement. If you believe people are made in the image of God, if you believe that Jesus has conquered the grave, this could foster the development of these kind of movements. But why is that a reason to believe Jesus actually rose from the grave? Isn't that a reason to believe that the story of Jesus appeals to the human heart, motivated people to live differently? Tie that to the actual resurrection for me.
Yeah, you asked hardballs right at the beginning. That's why I love coming on your show, Sean. Thank you for asking questions that skeptics and seekers alike are like, oh, thank you. We finally get to the good stuff at the beginning of the show. First off, I would take a lot more faith to believe in that scenario because the Christian movement had died. In Luke 24:21, the disciples on the way to Emmaus said, we had hoped he was the resurrection, but he's not. Jesus Christ was thought to be a failure like many of the other Messianic pretenders and contenders of the first century. The movement had died out, and why shouldn't it? Their Savior had, quote unquote, died on a Roman cross as an enemy of the state. But this one fact alone is what separates the Christian movement from all others, and that individuals, and they didn't feel like it, they didn't want to experience, this was not some kind of wish-filled thinking. They had left, they had departed, they had apostatized, if you would, and then boom, this one historical truth transformed them from running scared to being willing to risk their life, and in doing so, come up against the big worldviews of the Roman Empire, which again was hell on earth. So again, I can go directly from that experience. They didn't want it to be true. No one in nascent Judaism was expecting. This is another thing we should really point out, Sean. When we read the scriptures, we can't do so anachronistically. It's easy to say, oh yeah, Jesus, he died, and he died on a Roman cross. Very few Jews in the time of Jesus expected their Messiah to die. In fact, we see from the Dead Sea Scrolls and any other writings from late antiquity, late Second Temple Judaism, they expected the Messiah to show up and kill all the Romans, even kill the Roman emperor. So don't give me this message that our Savior is going to be crucified. He would have been thought of as a failure. So, and that's where we get into later in our interview, I'm sure. If they wanted to start with this narrative, it was a non-starter in the Roman Empire. If they wanted to make this up in some kind of wish-filled utopia, it just would have fallen on deaf ears.
We are going to get to that. That's point number 4, where you make a fresh argument. And then we're going to take some questions. I already see some great questions lined up here. Can't wait to get to them.
Fabulous.
But let's move to reason number 2. You say Jesus called it, meaning he predicted it. Go.
There are modern skeptics, some that are darlings, that say, Jesus didn't really know what he was doing. He certainly didn't claim to be God. He wasn't that sure of his messianic agenda. People who came later deified him, and in so doing put words in his mouth. But what does the scripture actually show us when we open the New Testament documents? And I believe that the New Testament documents are historical documents. I don't privilege the biblical text. I mean, okay. Sean, when I was in Oxford at Keble College at Faculty of Theology with Marcus Bachmuel, they made it very clear that you should not privilege the text of the Bible, but carry out your arguments. And one thing that these historical documents that make up the New Testament show us is that Jesus, in fact, did predict his death and resurrection. Mark 8:31, Mark 9:31, Mark 10:33 and 34, and Mark 14, when Jesus is asked, by the scholars, the nomikos, the scribes, the grammatus in Greek, who are you, Jesus? And, tell us, why have you come? And we hear it in Greek. He would have said it in Aramaic, but in Greek, it comes out, ego eimi, I am. Jesus is making a distinctive claim to deity linked with Yahweh of the Old Testament. And he says, I'm going to give you one sign. It's the sign of Jonah. I'm going to rise from the dead. And he did that. So he called it, I said, again, for those that are just joining us, perhaps you're new to Christianity, if Christianity had a hashtag, it would have been on the third day. Jesus does something that no one else could do. He messianizes Hosea 6. On the second day, on the third day you will raise this up. And that's one of Jesus's darling passages, Hosea 6:2, where he imports that into his messianic agenda. He messianizes that passage. He applies it to himself. And so we hear, and Sean, if you and I were observant Jews in the first century, we would have heard exactly what Jesus was doing. We would have been very familiar with Hosea and his promise of Hosea 6. We would have interpreted at the time as certainly a general resurrection in the future. Jesus said, no, on the third day, I will rise again. And so he called it. And why is it important? Why is that one of the threads of our body of evidence? Because if Jesus didn't really know what he was doing, then what's the point after all? No, Jesus makes it clear in the oldest documents that we have for New Testament nascent Christianity that no, he intended to die. He was giving the sign of Jonah, and then he adumbrated that. Which I only use 2 reasons from Scripture out of 7, by the way. It's this one and the next one. Not only did Jesus call it, but we roll right into reason number 3. We see adumbrations. That's a very important word of resuscitations. And I use that word carefully. I bring interpretive precision.
Now, hang on before we get to number 3. You are the first person to use the word adumbrated or adumbrations in one of my live streams. So congratulations. That is an SAT word. Nice job. Let me throw one objection at you before we move on to number 3. So you're making the argument that scholars would accept, you said Mark 8, 9, and 10, typically understood as the early written Gospels, that Jesus predicted his resurrection. The flip side to that Dale Allison points out in his recent book, in which he defends some of the resurrection but offers some critiques, he says, wait a minute, if Jesus so clearly predicted his resurrection, then why are the apostles so confused? Why won't Thomas believe for 8 days when his buddies, the apostles, say, we saw the risen Jesus? Why this lack of belief if he so clearly predicted it?
I have huge respect for Dale Allison and his commentary series and his work on the resurrection. We've had him speak and interacted with him as well in the scholarly work. But if I could just elbow in scholarly for a minute, I would just say this. It would be impossible for us to essentially, again, anachronistically go in and say, how didn't they believe this? We can't get into the disciples' head. They didn't believe a lot of things, and let alone the resurrection. I mean, that's where I see myself and the disciples. They had trouble and very, very much misunderstood the Messianic program. I know this show isn't about Judas, but I am of the firm opinion, and I've published this, that Judas simply didn't get the Jesus program. When Jesus introduces his Messianic program in Luke 4, and he quotes Isaiah 61, 1 and 2, and again messianizes those passages, Jesus knew what he was doing, but the disciples didn't really quite get it. In fact, Peter tries to stop Jesus from going to the cross. And so, that's almost for me an argument from silence in that, well, why didn't they get it? I mean, how, are you telling me they didn't really understand what he was saying? Yeah, we're telling you they really didn't understand. And again, we would have to make sure to think of ourselves in Jesus's world of Judaica. No one was going to the cross who was considered to be a savior. I mean, this was an outlier. And so I just can't come back more carefully enough to that point. That's something I learned back in 2009, Sean. Reading as a new believer at the time, as a what I would call a baby believer, I just thought, well, yeah, every Jew thought Jesus was going to die on the cross. So, look at Isaiah 53. Well, Isaiah 53's interpretive context has grown a lot in light of the resurrection. And before it, we see from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the sons of Kittim, the Romans, will be killed by this coming Messiah. So, we could talk about that at length. But again, there were a lot of things. I say this as a gospel scholar. A PhD knows a lot about a little. There were a lot of other things the Gospels the gospel writers just didn't understand, the disciples didn't get at the time. And I think that's why Judas fell out of the boat.
Good Good correction. The last one we want to confuse is Judas with Jesus. So
Yes.
excellent correction at the end. Good job. And great answer, by the way. That's really helpful. Let's move to number 3. Those of you who join us, we're here with Dr. Jeremiah Johnston, has a new book called Body Proof, where he walks through what he thinks are the 7 best reasons for the resurrection. Number 3, you said Jesus demonstrated resurrection power. Go.
Absolutely. And this is number 3, because if Jesus can proclaim that he's going to be resurrected himself, that he is the resurrection and life, he better prove that he can actually do this, that he has power over death. And we actually see again, there are 8 resurrections, by the way, in the scriptures. There are 3 in the Old Testament. Jesus performs 3. Then we have 2 in the book of Acts. And Jesus, I use this word adumbrations. He adumbrates. He foreshadows his forthcoming resurrection by raising recently dead individuals from the grave. Now, I make an interpretive distinction in my new book, Body of Proof, Sean, and again, this is what I've learned along the way. We can use emic and etic categories. We can bring certain language to the text that helps us have more precision in our interpretive tradition. And so, for example, like Trinity is not, we all know, is not
Sure.
in the Bible. When I say that Jesus resuscitated 3 individuals in the New Testament, showing that he had power over resurrection, I'm speaking about the widow of Nain's son. I'm thinking about Jairus' daughter. I'm thinking about John 11, Lazarus, his good friend, who could not have been more dead in the Jewish motif, dead 4 days. Jesus is showing that he has power over death, but these individuals would die twice. I give a fun lecture, Resurrection and Those Who Die Twice. In fact, did you know that Lazarus has 2 different burial spots? He has one, of course, in Bethany and another in Cyprus. Did you know you can go to the island of Cyprus today and you can go to the second burial spot of Lazarus, because he would die again, as would Jairus' daughter, as would the widow of Nain's son. Jesus is the first fruits of resurrection to have an undieable body, to have a deathless body. But Jesus still showed us he had power over death by performing those resuscitations. Now, do I believe they actually died? Am I claiming that they didn't die using the word resuscitation? Of course not. I'm claiming, yes, they were dead. And one of them, probably the widow of Nain's son, had died either that day or he had died the night before. In Jewish burial traditions, if you died that day before sundown, you were buried that day. If you died during the night, you were buried the very next day. So, the fact that Jesus would have put his hand on the bier, touched the bier, and the boy who was dead, Luke's gospel records, stood up in the burial procession, this would have been shocking. So I think it's important that Jesus foreshadows or adumbrates his power over death. And I just want to mention, if anyone's just joining us right now, only 2 of my 7 reasons emanate out of the scriptures per se. The rest of them are other evidences that we will get to.
And one of the things you do, which we won't do here, is elsewhere lay out a case for the reliability of the scriptures. Even if the scriptures aren't inspired or reliable as a whole, there's certain texts and passages that scholars accept that back up and make these points. So if people want that, they're going to have to go to your scholarly work to find it. I'm seeing some great comments, some great questions. We will come to these. But number 4, Dr. J, you better bring the goods, man. I mean, you said this is a fresh argument as far as you can tell. I'm giving you this platform. I'm partly messing with you. I put you here because I read it and I thought, you know what? I teach a class on the resurrection, and at least the way you approach this is unique. So I do think it's fresh as far as I'm aware. But here's what you say, and then those of you watching, give him time to unpack what he means.
Please.
Reason number 4, Jesus rose from the grave. No motivation to invent Jesus' resurrection narrative is evident. Explain.
Judaism in the time of Jesus is a coherent religion. There were other great rabbis and teachers who were loved, who were honored, and who were remembered. And any Jew, if you and I lived in first century Judaism, we would have honored our rabbi or this great teacher. And sure enough, yes, we would have believed this great Jewish teacher would rise again someday in the general resurrection. Sean, if you and I were followers of a rabbi called James, and so-called James is really a great, phenomenal guy. He even might do some miracles. He might even have some interesting stories about his origins. And he dies. We can honor our Rabbi James. We can believe that he will live again in the general resurrection? Absolutely. And we can carry on even his teaching. We have no psychological motivation to invent a resurrection narrative about our rabbi because we don't need it. Because Judaism is a coherent religion, we already believe in resurrection. We'll just get there a different way. In the general resurrection someday, when all Jews are risen from the dead, our rabbi, who we hold in high esteem and who we very much appreciate the impact he's made on the world and on our own lives, sure, he's going to be in heaven. But the disciples went further than that, didn't they? They had no psychological motivation. They didn't believe it. They were dejected. They had given up. Christianity was over, game over with Jesus' death by Roman crucifixion. And yet, they could have then carried on and said, hey, Jesus is going to be risen. I cannot make this clear enough. And I've published in Macmillan Interdisciplinary Handbook Philosophy of Religion. This is one of my cases for the resurrection that's now in secular schools in the textbook, I'm delighted to say. But this is the first time I've gone public with this new reason, this fresh argument. And I do think it's something we have to, when you talked about Dale Allison getting into the minds of the disciples, maybe I should think about it, going at it the way he argued at it. Because what is the psychological motivation to take the red pill, as it were, and go down this rabbit trail of a physical bodily resurrection if our faith doesn't require it? We could still honor Jesus. We could still follow his teachings. We could still write about him. We could honor him, venerate him in a Jewish tradition thinking. We believe in ghosts, maybe even a ghostly apparition. If, first century Jews believed in ghosts, they have all kinds of phantom stories, etc. We don't need to go to the extent of coming up with this story that Jesus rose from the grave, because we already have an airtight case in coherent Judaism. And so I just don't see a psychological motivation. If I'm going to do what I was taught at Oxford and not privilege the Bible, not privilege the biblical text, I have to ask myself, why do they even need a resurrection narrative? They don't need it unless it actually happened.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand. When you say there's no psychological motivation, typically what people say is, well, they could have a motivation for power. And even though Jesus taught about, giving up power and washing feet, even having some power like you see with the apostles at the beginning of Acts, it's amazing what people will do for some level of power. Or you could say something like, well, they had the psychological motivation of being famous. We all think about our posterity. As we're doing this right now, LeBron James is chasing the all-time scoring record. There's a sense of, I'm sure in his mind, that's like, wow, I could be known even when I'm gone as the all-time leading scorer. That's a human motivation. And frankly, it worked. I mean, the world knows the names Peter, Paul, James, and Jesus. So if I understand you, you're saying, given where we are now looking back, we could come up with some psychological motivation. But giving their background, what they believed, and the Judaism that they were a part of, it made no sense to come up with this story versus another story. Is that the heart of the argument you're making?
I think you've summarized it very well, Sean, because there would be no psychological motivation, meaning you don't need it. You can honor Jesus in the way that you want to honor him. You don't need to go make up a story that he died and rose again. And, I don't want to even speculate for our modern culture today, but think of just something really offensive, some offensive narrative out there today. It was offensive in the mind of the early Romans to discuss a physically deceased body coming back to life that had begun to rot and ripen in the grave. This was a non-starter for the early Christian movement. And so the motivation, I just don't see it. Judaism, they don't need it. And this is where we have done a disservice, and we need to do a better job as exegetes, making sure that we guide readers by the hand to read the Bible with first century eyes. We have to read the New Testament with first century eyes. We have to go to the land of Israel. We have to go to the Bible lands. I'll call it plural. And so we can really get into the world of the text. So we can understand what motivation would there be for a Jew to make up a story about a rabbi who died and rose again. It's not needed, because we have other stories of rabbis who are very much respected, but they certainly didn't make up a resurrection about them. And there would have been no promise for gain or power with that narrative. They would have had to take that narrative straight to their grave, and that's why we see it actually playing out that way.
As you know, one of the arguments that I've made is the apostles believed they'd seen the risen Jesus and are willing to suffer and die for this. Your point comes along and at least makes it even stronger that they didn't invent this for a lack of psychological reasons, given their Jewish background. Now, we have 3 more reasons you go through in your book, 5, 6, and 7. But before we jump to number 5, and then we'll take some live questions, you're arguing that they had no psychological motivation to do so. But then at the end of the book, you say, well, let's just assume that they did. They did a horrible job inventing this, even if they did make it up. So what do you mean by that?
So I have fun in this book, and this book's really written like if you're a gamer, we start with the easy level, and then it's normal, and then the last couple chapters, it's when you want to take that game and slide over to hard. Because if I had to do a PhD again, the last 2 chapters of the book, I'd be going in that direction. So I'm hoping, Sean, we can encourage some young scholars out there to check out my argument. I'm hoping they can bring it forward. Here's the deal.
Encourage some gamers to check out your book. You're a gamer, aren't you?
Yes, absolutely. My son is cracked on Fortnite, man. So let's go.
Oh, okay. All right, good. Well, hopefully scholars and gamers will check this out. Make your argument. Go.
So in 2012, Society of Biblical Literature, I presented a paper with a room full of scholars and skeptics and seekers. And at Society of Biblical Literature, it's fun because you present the paper and then scholars can react immediately. They can completely disagree. And they can actually strengthen your argument. And I was delighted because Craig Keener, a man that I respect highly, for those of you who don't know him, he's a classicist. He's an amazing author, a great scholar, a very fair scholar, and he's a true classicist. He said, Jeremiah, you are onto something with this argument. I presented the early version, many versions ago, of what is in the popular version now in my book, Body of Proof. And I just made several points that the gospel writers, if they want to have a theological or psychological motivation, hey, Sean, let's get together and come up with something. Let's write something very compelling, and let's really make this up in a way that it is going to impact lots of people. We see so much embarrassing narrative, and this is what I would come back to Dale Allison with. I keep thinking about that first question you asked me. The gospel writers do not hide the embarrassing narrative that we read in the Gospels. And they don't do that because the stories are true. And my whole crux of that chapter at the end of my book, if the gospel writers invented the resurrection story, they did a terrible job. And why can I say that? Did I just come up with that? So my area of specialty is I'm a specialist in extra-canonical gospels, 2nd century extra-canonical gospels. I don't say apocryphal because in England that's thought to be being pejorative or privileging the biblical text. So extra-canonical gospels, these are gospels-like writings. We have about 70 of which that didn't make it into the New Testament canon. My primary text is what came to be known as the Gospel of Peter. The Gospel of Peter is written in the late 2nd century, and it seems to be responding to the very same criticisms that we're talking about in this show. We have early objectors like Celsus and Porphyry. These would be 2nd and 3rd century objectors who ridicule. They attack the Christian faith for its lowbrow attempt to convince us that Jesus was resurrected. They didn't even see the actual event. In fact, we only know about the resurrection because of female witnesses. Why didn't he appear to the Roman governor? Why didn't he appear to the elite of his day? And you're going to read this if you learn Body of Proof. And truly, in 3 hours of reading my book, you're going to know more than 90% of people about the current state of resurrection research. I want to really encourage you to read it. It's right out of the heart of my life and our ministry. When we see these arguments that they're making, they don't make sense. And that's why they did a terrible job if they're trying to invent the narrative. But they didn't invent it. They shared it. It was true. And that's why we see this sober narrative. They're almost holding back at points, almost stunned themselves as they're reporting the events. I could see them looking back at the gospel writers saying, I can't believe I didn't see it. I didn't see it there. How could I have been so wrong? I mean, we've all been there in other experiences in our life. We didn't realize what a big deal it was at the time that we were having that moment. I could see that in the life of the disciples. And so I point this out in the chapter, and I give you specific details that are embarrassing, that just leave you wondering and scratching your head, why would you include that if you're trying to pull one over on us and invent a narrative? And so that seems to be a helpful way for Christians to specifically look at the Gospels. Our good friend, Gary Habermas, has done such a wonderful job the last 30 years bringing Paul into the forefront as a great source for the resurrection of Jesus. I'm hoping that this book, in a small way, will simply bring the Gospels back to the centrality of that discussion as well, with Paul saying, hey, let's not forget the Gospels are also great sources, and here's why.
It's really interesting when you get to 2nd and 3rd century. Celsus and Porphyry are saying things like, why does Jesus look so weak in the garden?
Yep.
Why are you holding up somebody who was crucified and making him a savior?
They talk trash, Sean. I mean, they literally
totally
talk trash.
But they don't.
And I give the quotes in the book.
And you're right, and it's not just talking trash. It's as if the gospel writers enabled them to do so. Like they're pointing out, why can't you guys get together here correctly which women were even at the tomb? So
right.
Your point in general is if they're making this up, they're obviously smart. We've got to at least concede that to them. It's just going to look differently. And I think that's a good point.
Can I add a footnote that I forgot, Sean, because I keep thinking about your great question?
Do it.
So in bringing up, why did I bring up 2nd century and my expertise there? The Gospel of Peter seems to fill those gaps apologetically. In the Gospel of Peter, which is not historical, it's not written by the Gospel of Peter, something like early Christian comic books. Jesus is gigantic when he comes out of the cross. Who does he appear to? He appears to Pilate. And by the way, and I've been very concerned. I was reading some work this morning, Sean, about the rise of anti-Semitism. I don't know if you've read some of this right now going on in our culture. It's disgusting. There was so much anti-Semitism in the 2nd century, and we even see that reflected in the Gospel of Peter, who absolves the Romans of any kind of fault in the death of Jesus. They lay the blame completely at the Jewish feet. Jesus appears. We even have the name of the Roman centurion. Of course, the Gospels didn't give it, so Gospel Peter is going to give it. His name is Petronius. And so we see this, what you might call gap-filling narrative. Haven't you ever read the Gospels? I'm talking about now the canonical Gospels. You're like, man, I wish I could have more. I mean, you can read the Sermon on the Mount in a few minutes, and this would have been a sugar stick sermon that Jesus gave many times, not just once. But don't you want to know more about it? I think that's why we're captured by the Chosen broadcast right now from my buddy Dallas. But when we open the Gospel of Peter, we see that the Gospel of Peter, and I'll give you another one, the Acts of Pilate, seem to be answering these early objections from Celsus and Porphyry and other early thinkers. They weren't the only ones who were saying, well, why didn't you invent a narrative, or why didn't you have Jesus before the high priest in his resurrection state? And the very fact that we have something called polymorphic Christology, that means we have a giant Jesus. The angels come out and meet him. He's gigantic. And then as Dom Crossan pointed out in his book, The Talking Cross, which I don't recommend, even the cross speaks and answers the voice of God. So, so that's why I brought up the 2nd century is, wow, have you ever read any of these documents? Why aren't the Gospels included in the canon? Well, have you read them? If you read them, you'll probably start answering your own questions. So I wanted to close the loop. Thanks for giving me the opportunity there.
Super helpful. Yeah, love it. Let's shift to your last three, and maybe we'll not Twitter. We don't have to be quite that fast, but we'll give your basic argument here, so to make sure we can get plenty of time for questions. I see some great comments and questions, people weighing in here. I didn't realize the first time you'd gone public making that argument, so I'm honored you chose to do it here. And I'm guessing there's going to be some criticism. Again, let me say, if people are going to do video reviews, fine, go back and check out Dr. J's scholarly work, and then maybe you and I can come back and take some of those point by point in due time. Maybe as it gets closer to Easter, we'll do something like that.
I would love
that. Awesome. Let's shift to number 5. You say written and archaeological sources overwhelmingly, that's a pretty strong word, support the gospel's resurrection narratives.
The juridical procedure that we see playing out in the Gospels is exactly what we find in Jewish burial traditions of the time. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. Jody Magnus, an atheist archaeologist from the University of North Carolina, who I footnote in the book, and others, So she has no theological motivation to say this, says, yes, the Gospels get it right. And so when you study the archaeology of burial traditions in Judaism, we see that everything that we read in the Gospels smacks of authenticity. So that's point number 5. I highly recommend that one because you need to know something about Jewish burial traditions, because you're going to hear other thinkers like Bart Ehrman, Sean, who claim that Jesus' body was likely buried in a criminal's tomb, if buried at all, and it could have been even eaten by wild animals. John Dominic Crossan claimed that Jesus' body wasn't buried, it was eaten by dogs. And this flies in the face of what we understand from Jewish burial traditions at the time in a non-war scenario in the time of Jesus and Pontius Pilate. So I give the reader a lot of helpful citations and just walk you through. Again, I want to introduce you to the real Jesus, the Jesus of the first century, the Jesus who lived and ministered in Judea and Galilee. That's the Jesus that I'm trying to introduce you to as a historian. Number 6, do you want me to move on to the other two?
Yeah, hold on. So let me ask you, one of the things towards the end of the book you go into is the garden tomb versus the Holy Sepulchre. Now, I've been to the garden tomb when it still looked like a skull face, and my heart just wanted it to be the right place. It felt like where the story should take place, and then you get to the church, it's like the opposite, how gaudy it is, and there's stuff built over it. But you lay out a whole chapter, so you don't have to go into the depth. But scholarly speaking, is there pretty good consensus and reason to believe that we actually have the burial spot of Jesus at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre?
Short answer, yes. I have 2,500 words to just help you, and that comes right out of the 60 or so hours, the edicule, which is that little house-looking building. It's just a little temple inside the Holy Sepulchre Church. Mm-hmm. The burial crypt of Jesus was open for just about 60 hours. I give you the explanations as well in the chapter because there's 6 different denominations, if you can imagine this, who have control over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. A ladder is still outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because no one can agree whose part of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre it is. It's been a 50-year argument, literally. So can you imagine they all agreed to allow archaeologists come in? And then this was put on display. This was in 2017. And I agree with you, Sean. I mean, I have a lacquer painting that I bought in the Jewish Quarter that's a beautiful depiction of the Garden Tomb. We lead tours to Israel. I'll always go to the Garden Tomb. But again, when I put on my critical hat, when I put on my historian hat, I'm taking my family straight to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because the data is just so good. That's likely the spot of Jesus's death and resurrection. And you might see if you go there today, oh, they're so close. You know, are you telling me Jesus was really crucified and 200 feet away he's buried? Shockingly, yes, when we look at the archaeology of the time. So thank you for bringing that up. So there's some great archaeology, some great, really helpful new stuff that I'm hoping the readers will learn in this book. And I want to mention this, Sean. I did this last night if you do an Amazon search, the resurrection of Jesus is understudied and underpreached in the church today. Outside of Easter Sunday and funeral services, we rarely hear about the resurrection. And I appreciate how your show, we've just dove into the deep end of the pool, and I love that. We'll keep doing it. But I do just want to point out, I'm hoping there are other thinkers out there that will start producing materials just on the resurrection of Jesus. Last night when I looked, I found only about a dozen titles of books that were just dedicated to the resurrection of Jesus, and half of them were scholarly treatments. And so I think it's a field that is fresh for the harvest, for you to do your own work in. This is not a sidebar issue in Christianity. There are 300 passages in the New Testament on the resurrection. The promise we're given more than any other is the promise of John 14:19, that because Jesus is raised, we will be raised also.
I love that. That's one of the things we do at Biola. I teach a semester class on the defense of the resurrection. In fact, sometime we'll bring you in to talk about that. So there is need for it. And I appreciate that you're a scholar that makes stuff practical. That's why I think you and I have so much in common. We both try to do that. I do have one more somewhat quick question, if it's possible. But the chapter on archaeology, in some ways, fictional stories can be built upon real archaeological events. Like the Avengers took place, and there's real places like New York, so to speak. So is this a reason that it's true? Or do you say this is just corroborative support that the biblical writers got it correct and aren't making this up centuries removed? What exactly does the archaeology show in your estimation?
Two things. Well, the archaeology shows that the gospel resurrection narratives, so the death and resurrection narratives, which, hear me clearly, which are embedded in the gospels, they get it right. We already see how the extra canonical gospels get it wrong. It flies in the face. Other thinkers like Peter J. Williams have pointed out, they even get the names wrong. They get the rivers wrong.
That's
the
true.
gospel juridical procedure, the death, execution, and resurrection of Jesus, they get it right. And here's the second point to your point. If it is true, there should be archaeological fallout for it. And there is.
All right, well said. Let's move to 6 and 7, and then we will have time for live questions from believers and skeptics. Number 6, you say, only Jesus' resurrection convincingly explains the conversion of people not previously his followers.
I don't think we appreciate that Paul was an ardent Pharisee. And again, he went by Paul and Saul. It was the context. He didn't become Paul. He was Paul the whole time to his Latin audience. He was Saul the whole time of his life to his Hebrew audience. So Paul was a chauvinist. The fact that I go into depth, his experience in Damascus and how that transformed his worldview from a chauvinist Pharisee to then eventually writing something like Galatians 3:28, we're all one in Jesus Christ, slave, we're not slave, we're free, we're not male nor female, we're all one in Jesus Christ. The fact that someone who had the upbringing, the educational pedigree that Paul did is astounding. And he was truly hostile to Christianity. We have hostile witnesses coming to faith in Jesus Christ, and we have this occurring in the first century. And so that's compelling to me. It's my point number 6 when we look at the hostile witnesses who come to faith in Jesus Christ. And the only reason Paul comes to faith in Jesus Christ is because he has an experience of seeing the resurrected Jesus, and that utterly transforms his worldview. And I feel like we gloss over that pretty quickly in chapter 6, especially with Paul. I go into it in depth. Gary Habermas has done a phenomenal job talking about James. What would it take for you to bring, Gary always says, to believe that your brother was the Son of God, and everybody laughs because it would just be impossible to think, a sibling could be the Messiah. Sure. And yet, what do we know from Josephus, AD 62? It's one of the reasons I date the book of Acts before AD 62. We see that Josephus tells us that James dies. And by the way, Josephus is not in the Bible, friends. He gives us something 28 times longer than any gospel, his writings. He says that in AD 62 that James dies believing his brother is the Messiah. That's Josephus telling us that. So I find that thread compelling. I certainly wouldn't leave it out because it's not just the friendlies, the hostiles were coming to Christ as well. They didn't want to.
So again, my class on the resurrection of grad students, at the end, we read books in depth. We look at N.T. Wright and Lacona, and we watch a lot of arguments for and against at times. I'll ask them, I say, what do you find you had to sum up the most compelling evidence for the resurrection? Some will cite the willingness of the apostles to suffer and die for their belief that Jesus rose from the grave. Many will cite the conversion of Paul. And what's interesting about that is a lot of the explanations to account for the disciples, if you say hallucinations, don't automatically apply to Paul. He's not a part of that group. He's an outsider. And it's fascinating. You mentioned Habermas earlier. The vast majority of scholars from the left to the right concede that at least Paul had an experience he believed was of the risen Jesus. And then he writes, what is it, a quarter of the New Testament, 13 letters. Even critical scholars accept 7 of them, and he's willing to suffer. There was some life transformation that took place. So I appreciate that you lay that out and include it. Now, the last one, and then we will go to questions. So for those of you with questions, type question in bold, and just keep your question as succinct and to the point as possible. We'll go to that. Your last one I find interesting. You said Jesus' resurrection is the only basis for making sense of suffering. So this is not a historical argument. This is more of a philosophical, existential argument. Why do you think his resurrection is the only basis for really making sense of suffering?
We said earlier that if Christianity is a resurrection-less Christianity, or as I point out in the intro section of my book, if the resurrection is just as William Telford, who examined me, a Markan scholar who was a disciple of William Barclay, he was my examiner in Oxford. If the resurrection is, to use his words, imaginative storytelling, then we have no faith at all, Sean. I don't know how you can be a Christian and not believe in the physical bodily resurrection of Christianity, of Christ, because we don't see that kind of faith reflected in the New Testament documents. Tom Wright has done a magisterial job in hundreds of pages of pointing out that everywhere we see Jesus' resurrection, it's a physical bodily resurrection. I mean, he hammered that case home with a slam dunk. And what I've noticed, Sean, in my travels ministering to individuals, real people, I didn't read this in a book. Think of my good friends, Dan and Lynn Wagner in Santa Cruz, California, who lost both of their daughters in a car accident. And he said, Jeremiah, the only reason I'm able to go on losing all of my children in the same moment is I know I will see them again. The promise of the resurrection is the only thing that keeps me going. I'm not living for the 80 or so years on this planet. I'm living for the resurrection. And I wrote this book with my little sister in mind, Jenny Lee. They lost their son, stillborn. We use his name. We say his name in the present, Wesley. Wesley is with Jesus. The first time that he opened his eyes ever in his life, he saw Jesus face to face. And so the resurrection is the only reason my little sister has been going. In a beautiful silver lining, she's now pregnant again, and they're having a son. Praise be to God. But I've seen in the real world, when words fail, Sean, when people are suffering and struggling, it's amazing how the promise, the hope of the resurrection that ignited the early Christian movement continues to ignite us with hope. When to face suffering will never be the same. We grieve, and perhaps my favorite verse, my favorite chapter in the New Testament, we grieve, but we don't grieve without hope. Why? Because of the fact of Jesus' physical bodily resurrection.
You know, if somebody were to say, I just don't think you're trying to make sense of suffering. This is a senseless, meaningless world, and so your argument doesn't convince me. What would you say?
I would just encourage them to keep their eyes on Jesus Christ. I do believe this world is messed up, so I would immediately identify with somebody who's been touched by suffering or grief. And I can see how you might feel that, so I want to empathize completely with you. But at the same time, the great promise of Jesus' resurrection is a new heaven and a new earth and new physical bodies where everything that's wrong will be made right. How is that not good news? As Lewis said, it just at the end of the Chronicles series, it just keeps getting better and better and better. That's the faith I believe in, and I see a great evidential basis for it. Living in Oxford, I heard all of the ironclad, arguments against the resurrection. I was utterly unconvinced by all of them. I'm more persuaded today, Sean, having read, in my opinion, most, if not all, of what there is against the resurrection. I'm more iron-fisted for Jesus Christ today than I've ever been, believing that Jesus physically, bodily rose from the grave. David Hume says wise men choose probabilities. And the greatest probability of what happened that day, and that early Easter morning, AD 30 or AD 33, was that Jesus physically, bodily rose from the grave. I think the evidence is compelling. And I point out also, we didn't have time to touch on it, the case against the resurrection. So I do lay out the case against the resurrection at the beginning of my book. So for skeptics or seekers, or just people that want to know more who are listening to us today, I don't overlook that. I do lay out very clearly, and I did this also for the textbook that I wrote for. These are the cases against the resurrection, and then we move on from that to the case for it.
You know, I appreciate on the question of the resurrection making sense of suffering that you led with empathy for people. The thing that I would add to that, and I think you're right, is I don't believe that most people think the world is meaningless and senseless. Our heart cry, the fact that we say something is meaningless, tells us we know there's meaning.
Absolutely.
If we were all blind, we wouldn't be running around saying, oh, we're blind, where's the light? We wouldn't be aware of it. So I think even that heart cry for meaning tells us we know there's meaning. And your argument is that the resurrection makes the best sense of meaning. Well, There it is, folks. You can go read his book. You can pick up the articles. You can go to the scholarly PDF and analyze it for yourself. Maybe we'll come back and take questions live at another point. But now let's take some of the questions that are here. Here's one that's popped up. It's succinct, it's to the point, and I know this is something you deal with in the book. As P. Weinbrenner says, question, is there a difference between Judaism burial rites and the rites for those crucified, for Jews who are crucified? So you talk about in your book a little bit, Jeremiah, how there are ways that somebody who was crucified was supposed to be buried in a certain kind of tomb, dishonorable. Flesh that out a little bit for us, how that relates to Jesus.
And Sean, thank you. This is an excellent question. And I just want to mention this for those of you that are authors. It is so difficult. And I'm not doing this to be self-promoting. I mean, Sean asked me to go over a whole book in a few minutes. And so I want to say this. I do get into the details. This is a phenomenal question. Would burial look differently for crucified criminals? And the answer is yes. But here's where we have to nuance it. A criminal being executed who's a Jew would have been buried not honorably, but properly. And if the Sanhedrin condemned a criminal to die, they were the only body that could do that, it was on the Sanhedrin to then bury that criminal. Well, what do we see when we open the Gospels? Who's asking for the body of Jesus? We know that it's Joseph of Arimathea. In fact, he offers his own tomb. No one had been laid there before, so it was a proper burial spot. If any of Joseph's relatives had been buried there, it would have been thought to have been an honorable burial spot. If Sean, a righteous man, dies and he gets buried, the McDowell family to crypt, that's an honorable spot. I, the criminal, would not have been on offer there to get buried. However, if Sean, a wealthy man, has a nice, really good spot, he's willing to put me in there, he could bury me properly, not honorably. And please get that rhetoric correctly. I've read some stuff from scholars where they talk that Jesus received an honorable burial because Joseph and Arimathea and Nicodemus buried him, members of the Sanhedrin. No, they didn't bury him honorably, but they did bury him properly. And so this is a great question. I get into the details of that in that section on Jewish burial traditions.
Here's a theological question. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I might just add, even a year later, Sean, if he would have seen, if he lived in the first century, we have this ceremony on the 1 year anniversary of death. Even if you were crucified, we would go collect the bones of your body in a process called ossulegium, which just simply means second burial. And that's why if you've, again, been to the land of Israel, you see you see a bunch of bone boxes everywhere. These are ossuaries with families, literally, that are buried together, stay together. Even the criminal's bones would have been collected and put then, a year later, at the anniversary of death, could be put into the family ossuary. So even at that point, we do see some similarities.
Typically, I've heard people say families that pray together stay together, but now those who are buried together stay together, however you worded that.
These are the delicious details you get in the interviews, Sean.
Oh, man. Let's move to a theological question. And this is from Rhonda. Rhonda, nice to see you. She jumps in a lot of the conversations. Really appreciate her being here and questions and interaction at time. So again, it's theological. She says, I wonder why Jesus, has to resurrect. He could die for sins without resurrecting, since we live on in spirit after death anyways. He didn't defeat death completely, since we still die. So bottom line, why couldn't he just die, pay for sins, and not resurrect physically? And clearly, it obviously didn't defeat death, since we still die.
So this is a phenomenal theological question. I want to encourage you to read Tom Wright's book, Surprised by Hope, because he points out that Jesus' resurrection is so much bigger than even our own individual resurrection. Jesus has to rise from the dead bodily to defeat the original curse, the original catastrophe, as it were, from Genesis 3 that brought the curse to the world. And this is where Tom does a wonderful job pointing out in his book, there's actually much more about the resurrection than there is about heaven in the New Testament. We hear a lot about heaven today, but the New Testament actually seems to focus much more on the resurrection than even heaven. heaven is the resurrection of Jesus and our fellowship with him in the resurrection state. And I think Tom points out the arc, as it were, of Jesus's resurrection has to be accomplished because we have to reverse death that began when sin was introduced in Genesis 3. So that's my quick theological response. This is a great question. And I would encourage you to dig into that book by Tom, Surprised by Hope.
That is a great book. One of the interesting things is when Jesus died, what is he doing? He pays for sin. He says it is finished. But Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus is not risen, our faith is in vain. Why? Yeah. Because the resurrection is like God's stamp of approval that death does not have the last word. Death itself now also needs to be defeated, not just sin. Mm-hmm. It's the penalty of sin, which is death. And so death has not ended now. Why? Because Jesus is the first fruits. This is the point, Rhonda, that when Jesus steps into human race, he's showing us evidence what's going to happen to all people at the end, which is the general resurrection. So spiritual death has been defeated, but we won't see all death defeated in a sense until Jesus comes back. But this is the sign and the guarantee that Aslan is on the move. Sorry, I had to have at least one C.S. Lewis reference in there.
I love that. Great.
All right, I see a ton of questions here. I don't know that you deal with this one directly in your book, but I'll let you give your sense. I know your mentor, Craig Evans, does. So this is a fascinating one. It says, they found the heel bone of a crucified man buried. And I assume you're referring to Yehohanan in around 1967, although they found a bunch of other crucified remains. This proves that not all crucifixion victims were tossed away. That actually wasn't a question. I think it was a comment. But does this help in your case? Does this challenge your case? What does the finding of a crucified victim and nail in the remarks mean for the case for the resurrection?
I'm impressed first, Sean, that you remember the dates, the names. I mean, poor old Yehohanan. He was crucified, and the sun must have been going down rather quickly because they went ahead and buried the crucifixion nail, which had fish hooked in his poor heel bone. I actually have the original photos from the discovery. They're black and white. Wow. And I do have permission to show those, so maybe I can send them to you after the fact. But it's a fabulous little picture. I mean, the wood washers were still there, and then they just disintegrated, but they got the picture right when they discovered it. You see a wood washer between the heel bone and the crucifixion spike, which fishtailed. This is more evidence of Jewish burial traditions. Is it important? Absolutely. Does it show us that we see burial with execution? Absolutely. And it also shows us something too, honestly. It gets into a whole nother discussion. Crucifixion nails, there's a lot of superstition in first century Judaism, and especially in late Second Temple Judaism. We see rabbis and other Jewish thinkers of the time, they're even buried with crucifixion spikes in their ossuaries because this is thought to give you good luck in the afterlife. So yeah, it's important. We use it all. This is great evidence. I talk about Yehohanan, and I can't remember if I do in the book or not, but I definitely discuss him in some of my lectures on it.
Awesome. Good response. Here's a question for you that I find fascinating. Relates your reference to the Gospel of Peter. Question: if the Gospel of Peter invented stories to answer questions, could the authors of Luke and John have also invented stories such as, look, I'm not a ghost, I have a body? And that seems, the ghost reference obviously is more in Luke, but in John you have the reference to Thomas, touch my hands and, touch my side. Details to answer objections. So bottom line question is, if you concede and are making the argument that the Gospel of Peter invented stuff for apologetic purposes, is it possible and or even likely that Luke and John did the same thing?
Great question, great thought, great counter question. The answer is no, because the gospel writers, their hills to die on are very embarrassing. They're very culturally unacceptable, whereas the Acts of Pilate and the Gospel of Peter and other late second century Gospels, they are not going to put anyone at danger. And when you read them, and I write about this, and I appreciate Sean mentioning my monograph, these are very unsophisticated, writings. There's a lack of sophistication in these writings. There's no comparison with what we actually read in the gospel narratives. The Gospels, in fact, are much more restrained in the things that they're saying, and we don't see them inventing something that would be on the same level whatsoever. Now, could anyone invent anything at any time? Sure, I guess is a general answer to your question, but it's not the same case that I see with the Gospels whatsoever.
That's a good response. Anytime I hear a question that says, is it possible? I always think of my friend J. Warner Wallace, cold case detective, who says anything is possible. In a court of law, we're dealing with probability. So we see it clearly in the Gospel of Peter. And as you mentioned, they get a lot of things wrong in terms of even archaeological claims.
Right.
Removed historically a century plus. The Gospel's written much earlier, powerful archaeological backing, embarrassing material, so it's possible, but not likely to me. And even in this case,
exactly. Like in the Gospel of Peter, Sean, we have the Jewish high priest spending the night in the cemetery. That would have never happened in real Judaism. So just things like that. That's what I mean when this is not a sophisticated work. Anyone who read it would almost have laughed at almost. That's why I mentioned there were like Christian cartoons, as it were. And again, nobody would have flown around in late second century and said, "Hey, I've got the Gospel of Peter." We have certain communities that would have appreciated it. In fact, Bishop Serapion mentions it, but it was nowhere thought to be on the same level as the canonical Gospels.
You know, what's interesting in this question is both this reference by Luke to Jesus not being a gospel, and in the end of the Gospel of John about Thomas touching the body, really assume that the body is physical. They're separate stories, but we have at least two independent testimonies to the physical body of Jesus. That in itself gives us multiple attestation of a sort, so to speak. Here's a question for you about methodology. As you know, there's differing ways people approach the resurrection. You had Gary Habermas write the foreword, which is amazing. Obviously, he and Lacona will take this minimal facts approach. Then there's others more like Lydia McGrew, Jonathan McClatchy, who take more of a defend the Gospels as a whole approach. So part of the question is, do you have a position on this? What might it be? If not, why? If you haven't gone public on this, you can just punt and make a statement later. But here's the question. I was giving you a little backdrop. It says, do you think the minimal facts is a sufficient argument for the resurrection? The McGrews, as well as others, say it doesn't give us enough about what was actually experienced by the apostles. What's your methodology as a whole is at the heart of what this question is?
You know, I'm not as ardent on it. We need both. We need all of these. We need to think deeply about all of these layers of arguments. I do believe we need to discuss the experience, though, as well. In fact, unrelated, I wrote the entry for a theology handbook on God's existence. And the main reason that we understand God's existence in the Judeo-Christian scriptures is their experience with God informed their belief in God's existence. So there is certainly an experiential factor, but make no mistake, faith is used in two ways in the New Testament. There is a body, a content of information that we have faith in, and then we experience faith as well. And I think we need both. And I think we're really being blessed by both camps, as it were, who are blessing us, McGrew's side and then Minimal Facts, with different ways of looking at the resurrection. Do I have a methodology? I do. I developed it right out of my research from the second century. I'm arguing from second century works through methodology right up until the early gospel narratives, just taking the narratives for themselves and saying, how do they seem to report the data, this factual experience of Jesus's resurrection? And so my jumping off point was extra canonical gospels and how they viewed the resurrection of Jesus, and then right up through the Gospels. It was a methodology. I didn't plan to do that. And again, they're really big on this. I didn't privilege the Bible. I was just following my research where it led. And so I kind of stumbled on it after the fact. Like, oh, this is a unique way to argue for the resurrection, and these are the 7 reasons why, plus 2.
You know, one of the points that when you invited me to speak at Prestonwood earlier at the Worldview Conference, one of my favorite speaking things of the year, by the way, 2,000-3,000 students. Craig Evans was there, archaeologist. He's been on the show. He's actually coming back soon. I know he's a dear friend of yours and a mentor. he was making a point
Yes.
that within Judaism, there's a built-in system how to deal with false prophets. So, for example, if Jesus claimed to be God, claimed to be the Messiah, claimed all these things, and then died a shameful death, he would have gone the way of the other false messiahs that you list within your book. But it didn't go that way with Jesus. Why is the heart of the question that you're asking? I love that. Does that get to the heart of one of the fresh arguments that you're making?
Yes. Why? What changed? Some of those failed movements, we read of 2 of them in the book of Acts. We know there's at least 10 Messianic pretenders. I get into a few of those in the Gospels, and there's actually many more. I get into those in my book, rather, not in the Gospels. But there's more, actually, that you can read about. So several. I mean, Jesus is not the only guy in the first century claiming to be the Messiah. And again, that's where the resurrection becomes the game changer. And so we see that without the resurrection, without this fact, there is no Christian faith. And I just cannot emphasize that enough, because, Sean, there is a movement today. Certainly we love Jesus. He's a great teacher, but did he really raise from the dead? That's a non-essential. We don't really need, we can have our cake and eat it too. It doesn't really matter. No, that is not the kind of faith that we see reflected in the New Testament.
You okay with a couple more questions?
Yes, I am.
All right, let's do it. Here's one I'm assuming comes from a skeptic. Dylan says, question, if I told you I dropped a pen and it fell upwards into the sky instead of down with no trickery involved, would you believe me? Would 2,000 years and many manuscripts make this more likely? I think the heart of it is, if I told you something that's ridiculous, like a pen flying upwards rather than downwards, you would think this person, somehow the message was lost. Maybe they've lost their mind. Maybe they're lying. Almost every other explanation you and I would rule out before we say this has happened, namely because we see what happens with pens. And the number of manuscripts isn't going to matter, nor is the amount of archaeology of the person who tells the story. I'm laying on to this to hopefully add to it. So why would you believe in a resurrection of something 2,000 years ago for which we arguably have less evidence than somebody telling you firsthand?
Right. First off, I don't think that the time, I can't privilege the data. So I'm going to look at the data the same way for a historical event that happened during the Civil War, the same way I would during the time of Jesus. There's about 1,800 years of difference there. I'm looking for early eyewitness testimony. I'm not looking at it desiring it to be true. I'm just assessing the evidence. And the evidence, as I assess it as a New Testament historian, is compelling to me. I don't want it to be true, and it's not less or more true because it happens to be 2,000 years ago rather than in the 19th century, like the Civil War. So I would encourage you, as you look at things critically, as you think critically through them, it doesn't matter if it was yesterday or if it was a different generation. We're going to apply the same critical test to any fact of history. And we're going to look at it carefully that way, through that lens. And Sean, what were you saying? I wanted to make sure I understood what you said as you were asking the question.
I was just getting to the heart of, if we dismiss somebody who says they've seen a pen like this, why not similarly dismiss an even greater claim from the past?
Gotcha.
One thing I would add to this is, I was thinking, is when we find a miracle, one of them is the context. So Hume famously said, if we claimed, I think it was like the Queen of England was resurrected or something, you wouldn't believe me. Well, there's no expectation. There's no scriptures leading up to this. That is a totally random kind of claim, just like a pen going up. But with the Messianic expectations, and if it wasn't just one pen, but it was a pen that, I was going to say floated on water, but I guess that's not going to work because probably some pens do float on water. So we'll just leave that analogy to the side. But all the other miracles that Jesus did, the people willing to suffer and die who said they had seen him, I think just makes it completely disanalogous to the example of a pen. But this also shows me the power of worldview. If I don't think there's a God, and I look at a resurrection story, I'm going to dismiss it. So I get it in a sense where the person's coming from.
Absolutely.
Let's do, I don't know if that one's going to help. There's lots of comments here. You know what? There's one. Let me go with this one. This is the last one I'll ask you. I'm curious if we're going to land with this. There's so many comments here. They're getting filtered through. But if I don't see it in
Thank you
5
all
seconds,
for participating.
there's some great participation and conversation going here. I literally lost it. There's so many jumping in. So the question was about the Shroud of Turin. And the question was phrased like, do you dismiss it? I'll give you my 2 cents.
Let's speculate together.
Well, I can't get super motivated to study the Shroud. And I probably shouldn't say that because I published on the resurrection and I teach a class. Maybe I'm missing something. At most, it showed that Jesus lived. No one doubts that. It shows that Jesus died by crucifixion. Nobody doubts that. So it's interesting and it's fascinating. I guess it raises questions if we could get the DNA of Jesus, what on earth that would mean. But as far as a larger case for the resurrection, it's interesting on one level, but I don't see the huge value apart from just the fascination in archaeology and the person of Jesus for the larger resurrection argument. Now, there's probably a lot of apologists who are going to comment and say, Sean, you're totally missing it. Fine, tell me where I'm missing it.
Yeah.
But I just can't get motivated, maybe it is, to care that much. And I think that's the first time I've said that publicly. What do you think?
Well,
Am I off base?
No. First off, there are some fine Christians who have done some great work on the Shroud. There's even non-Christians, believe it or not.
That's true.
Skeptics who've done some great work on the Shroud. So the Shroud is just an interesting thing. I'm interested in it because I'm interested in history. I'm specifically interested in this bolt of light that could create such a thing. I'm very interested in that, this energy, this bolt of light, if you will, at the moment, as we postulate of Jesus's resurrection, if it was able to almost capture that like a photo. I'm fascinated by that. So from a media perspective, I find it intriguing. It doesn't, in my world, I deal with so many people who are unchurched, so many people who have no prerequisite for the Christian faith. I just don't need it right now for my body of argument. Now, it's honestly, the verdict's still out on it. I mean, I would encourage people to just not be dogmatic, to be open to it. If you love studying history, I mean, you can get lost in the Shroud. I mean, I didn't touch it for my resurrection research. I didn't.
Oh, interesting.
I spent 0 days looking into the Shroud because, again, I study the texts. My research question was an Überlieferungsgeschichte, a German history of interpretive belief and resurrection in the Judeo-Christian motif. So I wanted to just stay straight with the texts, and that's why it finds its greatest expression in second century texts for me. And I have enough to say grace over with the facts and evidence that's coming out of my own research. I really don't have time to become a Shroud expert. But from time to time when I'm working out, I'll put on a video about the Shroud and just find it fascinating, and then I'll forget about it.
Fair enough. Well, let's wrap up. Let's do this again. I thoroughly enjoyed your book.
Yeah, I feel like we're
didn't,
just getting started.
Gosh, I have so many questions for you, and I apologize to those who I missed. There's a lot of questions, some related and some have nothing to do with it, which is fine. People having good conversations. There's some from believers, other skeptics. I apologize if I missed your book. I'm going to give another plug. I think it's excellent, Body of Proof, and I think it comes out in March. So if you see this before, we're almost 2 months before it's out. You can pre-order it, check it out. Is your dissertation and your monograph available to people who want to read that and go to the scholarly stuff? How would they find that?
It absolutely is, and I apologize. I don't set the prices. Any of you who have dabbled at all into scholarly works, these books we write for dozens are astronomically priced. So it is available. You can go to it's on our website at christianthinkers.com, which just simply routes you to the Bloomsbury T&T Clark. But it's like a $150 book. So that's why I'm trying to come out with some. You can get my book for $9, and it'll give you the good stuff from the. And I've also written an Oxford University Press, Macmillan Interdisciplinary Handbook, Philosophy of Religion on some of these things as well. So definitely still learning, still appreciating so much scholars like you, Sean, who sharpen me in my view and help me think deeper about other arguments, other evidence. So I just can't thank you enough for your great questions and having me back on. I hope it's been a helpful discussion for those that have watched and those that will share it with.
Well, you made my day that your book is $150 because my Apostles book was 100, dropped to 70. I think, I haven't checked in a while, it's about 50, which is still expensive. But my new line will be, get the Fate of the Apostles. It's a third as expensive as Dr. J's. So you made
Again,
my day.
We write these books for dozens around the world. So I don't know who prices these, but it is available in any case. It's still in print, by gosh.
Well, appreciate you coming on. We'll come back, and if there's more questions, maybe we'll do a response to it in due time. For the rest of you watching, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got a lot of other conversations coming up, including next week, posting an interview with an exorcist. The only words I have is, holy cow, it blew me away. Absolutely fascinating. That'll be next week. Ton of other topics. We're doing archaeology with your mentor, Craig Evans. We're going to talk about 5 just surprising archaeological discoveries and mysteries that people can't make sense of, and other topics. If you want to come study the resurrection with me, you can see the sign behind me. You like that new sign? I got it over Christmas, my new neon subtle Biola sign. They help sponsor this channel and make this possible, but I teach there full time. I love what they do. Have a full class on the resurrection and would love students. It's a distance program. It's graduate. Would love to have anybody who says, you know what, I'm going to go study the problem of evil. That came up. I teach a full class on that and others. There's information below. We even have a certificate program. I would love to have you join us. Dr. J, hang on 1 minute after just so I can say goodbye and thanks, but really appreciate you coming on. And I had to say it, but I've always wanted to have Bono on. If I never do, I will feel like I came as close as possible with those glasses. So thanks for joining me, man.
Hey, I up my game for you, Sean. Thank you for having me, man.
Thanks, buddy.